Anxiety is fear that has become conditioned in the mind. Sometimes our fears are warranted, the result of some sort of external threat. But other times, most times in fact, our fears are imagined. Fear, false evidence appearing real. When I was about 5 years old, I had many fears that felt very, very real to me. Like many of my friends, I was fearful of the monsters hiding under my bed. I used to love going to the beach and swimming in the ocean until my parents let me watch the movie Jaws for the first time. I was also really afraid of ghosts and vampires, and I'm a little embarrassed to say the Easter Bunny. I know. But those were normal fears for a little girl my age. Looking back on that time in my life now, I realized that there were some fears that weren't so normal. For example, when I was young, I had a fear that my family was going to die in some tragic circumstance. Plane crashes, car accidents, robberies. I even had a recurring dream that my parents were drowning in a giant pool of water, and I was sitting on the sidelines, not able to do anything to help. Those were some pretty intense thoughts and emotions for a kid my age to have to deal with. Over time, my anxiety began to expand and grow. And at about the age of 6, I experienced my first real bout of anxiety, specifically separation anxiety from my mom. I used to carry this picture around with me every day when I went to school, which made me look really awesome to the other kids. But I didn't care. I could not be without her. I feared it. What if something terrible happened while we were apart and I wasn't there to help her, or even worse, to say goodbye? Over time, these fears grew based on the experiences that I had and the things that I was exposed to. As an adult, my separation anxiety expanded. And when I met my husband, I could not be away from him for more than a few hours without panicking and breaking down that something terrible had happened while we were apart. That's the thing about fear. Once the seed is planted, it will grow and consume your thoughts if you aren't prepared to fight against it. Let's take a minute to talk about middle school, shall we? Can anybody take a wild guess as to what type of anxiety I developed in middle school? Thoughts? Social anxiety, yes. One of the leading causes of anxiety in our society is based on this fear of not being good enough. On the outside, even today, I was a bubbly, confident, outgoing person, but on the inside, I was constantly dissecting every conversation I had, worrying about what the other people were thinking or saying about me. Now, as I said earlier, sometimes our fears are imagined, right? Sometimes they are the result of some sort of experience or thing that we've been exposed to. And other times, anxiety comes upon us and fear appears in the form of a truly threatening situation. When I was in 7th grade, I remember sitting in Mrs. Ielpe's advisory class when all of a sudden the voice of the principal came over the loudspeaker. He muttered something that sounded kind of serious, but I had no idea what he was talking about. Nobody understood what he was saying, except for our fearless teacher, whose face turned pale. And I remember sitting there and hearing these phrases being thrown around like terrorist attack, World Trade Center, planes were hijacked. Now, I knew what the World Trade Center was because I had just been there 2 days before with my parents. But the other words didn't make any sense to me. And so I sat as parents started arriving to the school, picking up my friends, and I remember thinking, I wish my mom was there with me. Cue my old friend, separation anxiety. Now, as you all know, after that day, everything changed. Those fears became rooted in my thoughts and my emotions. My anxiety became like a living thing in my mind, and I could no longer tell the difference between what was a false threat appearing real and what was truly threatening. So what happened from there? I promise there is a happy ending to this story and a lesson to be learned, but unfortunately, things tend to get worse before they can get better. Like so many of the other 40 million adults in the United States who are living with some form of an anxiety disorder, I never spoke about what I was feeling, mainly because I didn't understand it. And other people kept telling me that it was normal, so I thought it was okay, which ultimately made things a lot worse. But let me tell you, anxiety is not just stress. Normal levels of stress and even anxiety are good. The fight or flight response is necessary and important for our survival. But when your stress becomes chronic and when your fears begin to intervene with your day-to-day life, it is worth it to reach out and say something. Let me give you a little lesson on anxiety here. This is what I've learned over time. I promise this won't be too boring. When the average person perceives something as being threatening, a fear response is triggered in this tiny area of the brain called the amygdala. So for example, when we heard the news on September 11th and I noticed the rather shocked expression on my teacher's face, a fear response was triggered in my brain, telling me that something was wrong and preparing to fight. Now, at that point, stress hormones are released throughout the sympathetic nervous system. And another area of the brain called the hippocampus helps the brain to interpret whether the fear is real, imagined, or temporary. Now, for someone like me, that fear response is often stored in the amygdala like a memory. So, in other words, you know that feeling of relief that you get when the perceived threat starts to disappear and life goes back to normal? That relief doesn't come so easily for me. So over time, my body continued to fight and my fears continued to build. And eventually everything came to a point. In March of 2017, I experienced the worst panic attack I had ever experienced up to that point. I was a teacher at the time, and I was escorted home from work that day by the principal, who lovingly drove me 45 minutes back to my house to make sure I was okay. Now, I left there feeling completely broken and ashamed. From that point, I entered into a state of depression that lasted about 7 days. And in that time, I retreated into my mind, and my mind took me to dark places that I did not even know were there, and that nobody else understood, by the way. After a week of questioning everything, my life, my abilities, my mind, and my sanity, I finally broke free. And here's how I did it. I started working with my fear instead of against it. So think of it this way. Anxiety is like a giant pimple on your face. What happens when you try to pick at an unwanted blemish? It gets red, tends to get bigger, gets irritated, right? So like a pimple, anxiety is painful, it's frustrating, and it can attract some unwanted attention. But if you pick at it in an emotional frenzy and a desperate attempt to make it go away, what are you left with? A scar. So you have to learn how to work with your fears. Be patient. Let's take another look at our fear. Feel your feelings. Examine your thoughts. Anticipate your triggers, release, and forgive. This simple acronym is what led to my healing. Feel your feelings, but do not become them. Stop blaming yourself for feeling anxious or sad or angry. It's so easy when those unwanted emotions come up for us to look in the mirror and say, just stop it already. You're being crazy. Let it go. But when you're feeling badly about something, yelling at yourself or trying to ignore the emotion altogether is only going to amplify the issue. Examine your thoughts. Think about it. We talk to ourselves more than we talk to anyone else in life. Thoughts become things, so keep them pure and keep them kind. Anticipate your triggers. When the fear begins to rise up, document it and ask yourself the very important question of why. Why am I so afraid right now? Why am I feeling this way? We ask other people questions like this every day, and yet for some reason we deny ourselves the same opportunity to discover what's wrong. So take a moment, breathe, think, and finally release and forgive. Release the negative emotion, and most importantly, forgive yourself for not being perfect in that moment. Now, looking at all of you, I know some of you are thinking, Amanda, that's great, but it sounds a lot easier said than done. And you are correct. Healing takes time, and it takes patience and love and support, and not just from those around you, but from yourself. So I'm here to tell you that it's okay to be afraid. It's okay to fail and to fall down. It's okay to question who you are and where you are. You're not supposed to have all the answers. But remember, you are not your fear. You are not your anxiety. And you control more about your life and your emotions than you ever thought possible. Thank you.